Another day, another atrocity committed in Europe in the name of Islamist extremism, the very same extremism that British governments and indeed for that matter French, Belgian, Dutch, German and other European governments have been facilitating, arming, financing and affording endless propaganda support to, as long as they limited their atrocities to Syria. I make no apology for returning to the issue of the Manchester Arena bomb. It's personal for me. I was less than a mile away when that explosion occurred. I therefore saw with my own eyes the tumult and the pain that was suffered when an Islamist extremist incinerated himself and as many children as he could take with him in the Manchester Arena bomb 1 year ago. And I'm particularly interested in it because the mass murderer, the child killer, Abadi, was the son of a leading member of a cell that was, and there's no kind way of putting this, I say to the chaps in Thames House and at MI6 headquarters, an asset of the British intelligence services. And Theresa May, who was by then the Prime Minister, had as Home Secretary in David Cameron's government facilitated the passage to and fro Libya of the very man and his ilk who murdered our children in Manchester, to and fro to Libya, as long as they were doing their killing there, killing on our behalf, killing on British government orders, killing on Her Majesty's too secret service. I make no apology for returning to the Grenfell inferno either. Again, as you've heard me say, I open my door in the morning and look up at Grenfell Tower. I smell Grenfell Tower until this very day. My youngest son goes to school with children who survived the inferno of Grenfell and the pitiful excuse for an investigation and prosecution of those responsible for the Grenfell inferno will always be in my sights. Now, I have a dim memory, it may be flawed, going back to the 1980s, when Roseanne Barr was considered a progressive, was considered one of us. I dimly remember that she and her co-star and screen husband George were comrades of ours in the fight to defend the revolutionary government in Nicaragua, the Sandinista Liberation Front. I don't know what happened to her. I don't know which particular Kool-Aid she drank, but she's now deep down in the swamp. It's a Trumpian swamp. However much those libertarian, civilized supporters of Donald Trump think they're being sophisticated and that the King Kong that they are supporting in the White House is somehow anti-establishment, is somehow trying to drain the swamp. As a matter of fact, Trump is filling the swamp with racist poison. And Roseanne Barr, long ago, drank the racist poison. I have watched agog over these last years, these Twitter years, as she sank deeper and deeper into racial supremacism. When she became Israel's greatest supporter in the world, she was, less than a year ago, in Israel saying that she was moving there. Perhaps that will now be expedited, because after all, Netanyahu, who deports black people to wherever he can bribe to take them when they have arrived in Israel seeking their legal right to asylum and refugee status. Racism is big in Netanyahu's Israel. Roseanne is a big, if you'll forgive the pun, supporter of Netanyahu and Israel, and she was feted less than a year ago at a gala dinner for the Jerusalem Post, the apartheid rag in Israel. And she said, I'm thinking of moving here and running for Prime Minister. Well, be careful what you wish for, Jerusalem Post. Roseanne Barr described a distinguished, highly educated, high-achieving black woman, government official, as a monkey, as an ape, as a child of the planet of the apes. Overnight, Roseanne Barr has been reborn as Joan of Arc, martyred at the stake of freedom of speech. Well, as I've said to you before, there is no such thing as freedom of speech, at least not outside of the jungle, not in a society governed by law, not in a democracy where the rights of everyone have to be protected. There is no freedom to speak hatred and to incite racial and religious hatred against others weaker in societal terms than yourself. And just en passant, though it might be body shaming and it might be politically correct, the idea that Roseanne Barr has the right to comment on anybody's appearance is truly astounding to me and maybe to you. She's been sacked by ABC, but another offer must be about to come along in a minute. Because, don't you know it, Roseanne is now the new martyr on the other side of the Atlantic for the cause of freedom of speech. Now, reporting restrictions have been relaxed on the case of her counterpart, the jumped-up little Hitler of the English streets, Tommy Robinson, the little British fascist, who's also, by the way, a fanatic supporter of Israel. I've got the pictures. I've got the pictures of Tommy on board the Israeli tanks holding the Israeli weapons. Although both Roseanne and Tommy are not averse to a bit of casual anti-Semitism, they sure love Israel. And I'll be speaking later today on an American radio station to someone I respect, Lee Stranahan, on the US network that I regularly broadcast on in the afternoons. Lee Stranahan has adopted Tommy Robinson as his saint of freedom of speech. Even though Lee will be sitting next to Garland Nixon, a black man in Washington, when he talks to me this afternoon, he doesn't appear to know that Robinson's only concern is whipping up hatred against brown people, black people, people with Muslim names. 92% of all these sexual offenders against children in Britain are white with English names. 93% of the people on the register of sexual offenders against children in Britain today are white people with English names. The Catholic Church is being torn apart because of organized, systematic pedophilia in its ranks amongst its priesthood. But neither Tommy nor any of his ilk have ever protested outside a Catholic church. And don't you know it, in the very week that Robinson was sent to jail, in the very week, one of his right-hand men in the so-called English, so-called Defence League was sent to prison for 14 years for persistent, systematic rape of a 10-year-old girl. And Robinson has said nothing about it. These hypocrites are parading not their commitment to freedom of speech, they're parading their commitment to racial supremacy. Roseanne and Tommy. Discuss 0344 499 1000. And we'll be talking about Italy. If you ever needed a reason why Britain must, as it decided to do, withdraw from the European Union, it's being paraded to you right now in Italy, where the EU Commissioner, a German, no less, in clipped Prussian tones, told the Italian people that the markets would have to teach them a lesson as how to vote for the right thing. Where the president, under orders from Brussels, has destroyed the electoral mandate of a coalition government which won the election, won the votes of more than half of the Italian people. And that's not easy, by the way, in a multi-party state like Italy. Told them that they could not have the finance minister of their choice because that finance minister is against the currency, the euro, so beloved of the European Union. And so the Italian people, like the Greek people before them, are being jackbooted by a German-led European Union into submission. But guess what? The Italian people ain't going to put up with it. And when the next election comes in Italy, I predict that the anti-EU forces will sweep to even greater victory, and anyone standing up for the Junkers and the rest will be reduced to total irrelevance. So, the Grenfell fire, the Manchester Arena atrocity, Italian elections, Roseanne Barr, Harvey Weinstein, Tommy Robinson, it's all coming up. And one more thing. Formerly of this parish, my good friend Richard Madeley became an overnight interviewing hero of the whole country when he treated Private Pike, Britain's Defence Secretary. Don't tell them your name, Pike! Gavin Williamson was shown the door by good old Richard Madeley, who showed these poor excuses for journalists on Newsnight, on Channel 4 News, the way to handle lying politicians that squirm and wriggle their way out of giving an honest answer. Now, not least because he thinks he's Elvis, Donald Trump made an extraordinary speech, of all places, in Nashville, where Elvis made his early Sun recordings. He made a speech in Nashville, Tennessee yesterday, in which he said, or rather bellowed, that African Americans in Nashville, Tennessee have been voting blindly for Democrats for well over a century. I'll just leave that hanging in the air so you might contemplate it. The President of the United States thinks black people in Nashville, Tennessee have had the right to vote for well over a century. You know what, Mr. President? They don't even properly have the right to vote today. But I'm starting off with Libya. The very finest of all British foreign affairs journalists is Patrick Cockburn. He's the grandson of the greatest of all journalists plying their trade in these islands, the great Claude Cockburn. It's always a pleasure to speak to Patrick, but I'm speaking to him today on the back of a powerful article in Counterpunch. Counterpunch online is worth a read, and I read it virtually every day. And in that article, Patrick Cockburn examines the tangled web of British involvement with the very Islamist fanatics who tore our children to pieces a year ago in the Manchester Arena atrocity. And he joins me now. Kindly, Patrick, thanks for coming on the show.
No, thank you.
Would you summarise your piece in Counterpunch for us, please?
It has two main points. One is that the the atrocity in Manchester wouldn't have occurred if the British and French governments, backed up by the US, had not intervened militarily in Libya in 2011, overthrown Gaddafi, and reduced the place to a continual civil war in which the main protagonists are Islamist militias. These are the people with whom the family, the Abedi family, who produced Salman, the bomber, were associated and had been associated before 2011. Secondly, there's a more specific reason that some of these people I just mentioned, Libyan exiles, anti-Gaddafi Islamist exiles in Britain, mostly in Manchester, had been considered too dangerous to travel or do anything unmonitored up to 2011 because they thought they might go off and join Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But as soon as the military intervention in Libya started, they suddenly, to their own amazement, found that their passports were being returned and they were being ushered through British airports on their way to Libya to fight against Gaddafi. And this to and fro, again, made life easy for people like Salman Abedi, who ultimately returned to Manchester and blew himself up, killing all these people, mostly children, in the Manchester arena.
Now, I can go back even further because I saw this cell of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name. I saw it with my own eyes, effectively being assembled prior to Theresa May, prior to David Cameron, during the Blair-Brown era. I saw these fanatics being assembled in Manchester. They all congregated there. I've met them many times. I know some of them. They were harboured here, weren't they, for the day that they might become an asset in a British government policy, which was constantly changing, of course, over that period, to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya.
Yes, I mean, this is absolutely correct. And you know what's extraordinary is that this happens again and again. We've seen the same thing happen in Syria. That at a certain moment, these incredibly dangerous people, fanatics, whose main tactics is suicide bombing directed against civilians, are at one moment under surveillance, and the next moment, at a politically convenient moment, when they seem to be fighting opposed to enemies of the UK or France or America or someone, they suddenly opportunistically become allies. And this happens again and again. And it happened this time with the Libyans and in Manchester.
Now, it was the Brown government that lifted the control orders on the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Manchester, but it was Theresa May who gave them their passports back. And isn't it true that Salman Abedi, was travelling back and forward between Manchester and Libya, and when in Libya, he was actually fighting, and the British security services, intelligence services, obviously knew that. One might even speculate that they facilitated that. And yet no supervision of this man who was fighting with ISIS and Al-Qaeda elements in Libya, fighting alongside them, was the very next week or month back in Manchester, and no one was supervising him. Worse than that, no one was acting on warnings about him that even from his own mosque in Chorlton, very near to where I used to live, were giving to the authorities.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. And I think a point to make is that, this is not secret information. I mean, a lot of what I was saying appears in a House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee report, which is pretty devastating, which was published last year. It didn't make much impact in the media, but it spells out, the course and the failings of British policy in Libya in 2011. As regards the Abedi family, there are pictures freely available of Abedi's brothers, with automatic weapons in their hands, fighting on the Islamist side in Libya, one of the many Islamist militias. So there's nothing sort of secret about this. And yet they did it again. I mean, the authorities did it again. They allowed these people free passage, or they didn't monitor them or didn't monitor them closely, and have somehow evaded responsibility for this. That also is pretty strange. And one point I was making in this article was the, very understandable grief and mourning of survivors, of people in Manchester and others, and people saying we don't want to divide our community. The emphasis is not on blame. But this is good in many ways, but it also has a downside, which is lets the government off the hook, that there isn't any real investigation into exactly what they did that allowed this event to happen. Although, as I said, many of the most damning facts are freely available and well known.
It may not have made much of an impact in the media, but the aforementioned Select Committee report quite quickly got the chairman of the Select Committee unhorsed. He's the ex-chairman of that Select Committee. Patrick Cockburn, as always, pleasure to talk to you, and I encourage everyone to read that counterpunch article today by Patrick Cockburn on the Manchester Arena atrocity. Lies everywhere in the political class. And didn't Richard Madeley puncture the bubble of Private Pike yesterday? If you haven't seen it online, it's well worth watching. And I'm going to be speaking to Richard, formerly of this parish, in the last hour. Talking also to Caroline Frost, the great entertainment show business editor, author and sage, about Roseanne Barr and Harvey Weinstein, who certainly seems to have come a cropper. I'll be talking to Stephen Wolfe, member of the European Parliament, about the Italian elections also. And I'll be talking to Madiha Raza, Global Communications Manager at Muslim Aid, about Muslim Aid's Mind the Gap report, which deals with the Grenfell Tower disaster. But let me read some of the material that's coming in. Donnie sends an email. Morning, George. As a shopper at Whole Foods, I'm a little concerned where this company is heading after being taken over by Amazon. Whole Foods quietly halts GMO labelling requirements. A year after Whole Foods was acquired by internet retail giant Amazon, the food company is backing off its commitment to ensuring that food suppliers inform the consumer and the store itself if their food products contain GMOs. My goodness, what's the world coming to? And Alicia says, good morning, George. I'll be listening to you as per usual. Please mention Bill Browder today. Many thanks. Yes, he's the man who was seized in Spain, or at least there was a call for the actioning of an Interpol warrant for his arrest and his repatriation to Russia to face criminal charges there. It turns out, I think, that that's not going to happen. We couldn't have that, could we? Oligarchs being held to account, except if they're Russian oligarchs in London. Barry in Enfield says, George, looking forward to the show. You'll be glad to know the dog walking problem is solved. Yesterday, I purchased a personal DAB radio, so now I can walk the dog whilst listening to the mother of all talk shows. Thank you very much for that, Barry. I'm amazed the number of people who are listening to the show, not only across the world, but on various platforms, through various mechanisms. I have in my mind's eye a kind of fireside chat model where I'm FDR and you are a family sitting quietly around a radio set and listening to this show. But it turns out that people are listening to it on their phones, on their Alexa. Other models are available on their personal DAB sets, through apps, all kinds of things. Just not yet on the Sky platform on the TV, which is where my old mother likes to listen to it. Please action that this day. Lizzie says, Hungarian George Soros has behaved disgracefully by paying towards a second referendum over the heads of our elected but weak government. This is fascism. He has bought our country for £6 million. This fiscal gigolo made a million on the stock market when the pound dropped. Do we want him running a puppet pro-EU government in the UK? Well, Lizzie didn't make a million. He made several billion on the collapse of the pound. He betted against the pound in the currency speculation markets and netted well over £1 billion in profit as a result. And therefore, the many millions, not just 6, that George Soros, an American citizen, a Hungarian-American citizen, has put into the anti-Brexit campaign in this country is an absolute outrage. When you think of the crocodile tears, the fake synthetic rage that was engendered by the allegation that the Russians fixed the Brexit referendum, when it turned out they spent less than 90 pence on Facebook advertising. And here's a man whose campaign was launched today, openly telling us, that's just what he's telling us, is putting £6.5 million into wrecking the implementation of the outcome of a referendum that we were told was binding on the British government, on the British state. As a matter of fact, the British government of the day, the British state of the day, spent £9 million circulating a document, a pamphlet, which explicitly in black and white stated that whatever we decided, the government would implement. And they're playing with fire, these people, you know. They don't understand it. They're playing with fire. Social peace itself in our island is at risk by those seeking to subvert, to corrupt, to overthrow a decision by 17.5 million British people to leave the EU. Now, George Soros, I mean, he's brazen. I mean, you've got to hand it to him. He's not just giving the money and keeping stum. Oh, no. George Soros himself told us today that he felt that his money was well spent because a second referendum would, he said, by a substantial margin, show that the British people no longer want to leave the European Union. Well, if that were true, the British people would have to be blind to the reality of what EU rule means in Italy today, in Portugal before it, in Greece before that. The EU is a German-dominated bankers' ramp for permanent austerity government and the neoliberal economic prospectus. Membership of the EU makes a Corbyn-MacDonald government utterly irrelevant because virtually none of what they want to do would be allowed to be done if we were members of the European Union, or members of the Customs Union with the European Union, or members of the EEA, or EFTA, or any of the other alphabet soup alternatives. If you want a radically different Britain, then you need to leave the EU. Now, people say to me, someone said it last night, well, if we get out of the EU, we'll become ever more subservient to the United States. What, more subservient than we are now? But we'll get the government we vote for. We'll get the foreign policy we vote for. We'll get the social and economic policies that we vote for. We'll get the international relations that we vote for. Have some confidence in yourselves as people to choose your own government that will govern your own country in the way you want. I'm George Galloway. I'm here for Mike Graham every day this week between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. The phone number is, as it always is, 0344 499 1000. You call us, we'll call you back, and therefore it might not cost you more than a penny or two. You can also email me, tweet me, text me, and you can, above all, listen and bring other listeners into what is the Open University of the airwaves. Now, Muslim Aid have produced a report handily entitled Mind the Gap. It's a review of the voluntary sector response to the Grenfell disaster. And it says that the institutional response to the disaster was, and I quote, badly flawed in the first crucial days, and the damage that resulted has been difficult to repair, and that the voluntary sector was, quote, very much on the front line, unquote. Now, this report, which I haven't yet read in full, chimes with my own experience as a near neighbour of the Grenfell Tower. And as I said, my youngest son goes to school with survivors of it. I smell it in the mornings. And I was, until quite recently, an elected school governor at a school with many Grenfell survivors in it. So I know what I'm talking about. And so does Madiha Raza, the spokesperson for Muslim Aid. Madiha, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, George.
Please summarise what the report is arguing, will you?
Well, this report looks at the roles and responsibility of the voluntary sector to this disaster. It particularly looks at the lessons that can be learned from the special value that the diverse voluntary sector organisations can bring to the table, and how this support should be galvanised, championed and coordinated better to work more efficiently and effectively in future times of emergency.
Now, why Muslim Aid? The victims of the atrocity at Grenfell were overwhelmingly people of colour. Were they also majority Muslim?
They were. I think almost 50% were Muslim, and at the time many of the people were fasting.
Indeed, so it was Ramadan exactly a year ago. Now, what are the principal failures? Identify them if you would.
I think it was just a pure lack of coordination, on the ground at the time. People, the local authorities, by their own admission, were ill prepared. So the voluntary sector did step up, and although also quite unprepared, I think the voluntary sector and local organisations, neighbours, churches, and mosques were just better placed to respond because they were aware of the nuances and sensitivities on the ground at the time. As you said, many of the people were Muslim. So organisations like Muslim Aid were just more sensitive to the need. For example, providing halal meals for the evening iftar meal, faith-sensitive clothing, that kind of thing. And I think that's how the voluntary sector were able to step up.
There is a danger, isn't there, in critiquing the role of the voluntary sector, that the state sector, local and national, that we pay very, very good money to, whose failures were manifest and continue to be manifest until this day, that it somehow lets them off the hook?
I think that Grenfell has been a big wake-up call for everyone. And I think it's definitely about how we're going to work together moving forward and in the future. And as far as I know at the moment, the government are looking to make the responses to such incidents more efficient. And that's exactly what we're calling for in this report. We're calling for the government and national actors to include the voice of grassroots and local organisations, because, as I said before, we are the ones that know what's happening on the ground at a local level.
Yes, but, this is a country that suffered the Blitz. This is a country that was partially destroyed by Nazi aerial bombardment. We ought to know, oughtn't we, in 2017, how to respond to a disaster like Grenfell. We ought to know that for fighting fire in tall buildings, you need tall ladders, you need helicopters, that in avoiding fire in tall buildings, you don't strap cyanide paneling onto the buildings. You need to know that we need sprinklers. You need to know that we need proper fire exits and entrances for firefighters. I just have a feeling that there's a danger of letting the main culprits off the hook in this affair.
Yeah, I mean, I think by their own admission in the independent task force review that the government have published, by their own admissions, they've had some epic failures in the response to the disaster. And I think just today a report released said that they're going to replace all the fire doors in the area. And I know that's just a small step in making things better, but as I said, I do think it's been a huge wake-up call. And as far as I know, the government with local actors are very extensively reviewing how they're going to respond to such incidents in the future.
Well, I suppose my line of questioning betrays that I don't believe that it has been a wake-up call. I don't believe they've woken up at all. And as long as the victims of such disasters are poor people, people of colour, council tenants, Muslim people, there'll be no wake-up, because the lives of such people are not actually all that important to the people that rule us. That's my view.
Yeah, that is an interesting view, and I think that's why we're calling again and again in this report for the voice of local faith, non-faith organisations to be called upon, because we wouldn't want another situation like this, which results in people being disenfranchised with the government, and that's why it's a matter of making sure that all grassroots organisations and voices are heard.
Now, how do people get access to your Mind the Gap report?
It's on our website, www.muslimaids.org. It's on the front page of the website. You can access it there and download the full report as well.
I'm sure many people will. Thanks very much, Madiha Raza, Global Communications Manager at Muslim Aid. We're talking about Grenfell. In the wake of the Muslim Aid report, we're talking about the Manchester Arena mass murder by an Islamist fanatic whose family and many families like his were assets of the British security services in Manchester, encouraged to congregate in Manchester, their control orders lifted. They were, after all, called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The clue was in the name. Their passports returned, encouraged to go to Libya to fight alongside ISIS and Al-Qaeda, allowed freely to return whenever they liked to Manchester, and one of whose sons incinerated all of our children a year ago in Manchester. We're talking about Italy and the EU and what it means for Brexit. We're talking about George Soros and his £6.5 million bung to the Wreck Brexit campaign, led by Tony Blair and Alastair Campbell. My goodness, aren't you judged by the people with whom you travel? Now, Darren Alevi says on the email, "Hi George, so glad you're talking about Italy. Could you also talk about the possible impeachment of the scandal-riven Spanish government of Mariano Rajoy, and also talk about Erdogan's snap election moves because of the falling lira in Turkey?" And Bamboleo says, just a reminder, George, Tommy fake name Robinson's brothers in the EDL actually wanted to cover up their child-abusing buddy. The hypocrisy is staggering, but alas, not surprising. And he encloses a tweet which shows that cover-up attempt in black and white. Fra says the DUP delegation with Friends of Israel in Jerusalem doing business deals while Palestinians are being murdered in Gaza and arrested in the West Bank. Settlers of a feather flock together. Simply shameful. And CD says, why have a picture of Lord Knock Knock? Is this a special on Kinnock or the Lords? Well, I thought the portrait of Lord Kinnock in ermine summed just about everything up about our political class. Neil Kinnock, when I knew him, stood and spoke, and very eloquently, for the total abolition of the House of Lords. He spoke, and very eloquently, for British withdrawal from the European Union. That was before he and his wife and his children drew fantastic emoluments from the European Union, and before both he and his wife and his son, I've no doubt in the future, all became members of the House of Lords. Also, I just like laughing at the picture. Here is, Mark, Bournemouth Brexit Battalion. Mark, stop signing yourself thus. You're giving Brexit a bad name. George, why are you in denial? The problem is Islam, which you run away from. Facts are, George, Presbyterians, who you call bigots, believe Muhammad is a biblical false prophet, making Islam a cult of Satan. So it comes as no surprise to millions of Presbyterians and Calvinists in general that every Muslim is a potential terrorist. Learn it, George. Regards, Mark, Bournemouth, Brexit Battalion. Great show, George. Mark, first of all, it's a surprise to me that there are millions of Presbyterians and Calvinists in Britain. Certainly church attendance doesn't suggest that that is true. And if you want to communicate that 2 million British people are terrorists and part of a cult of Satan, you're not welcome here. And I've told you before, don't write to me again. In fact, you're banned from listening to me. Henceforth, I don't want your ears anywhere near my voice. Now on Twitter, the Communicipalist says the EU is attempting to suppress democracy in Italy, undermine popular democracy in the UK, with help from cash-stuffed oligarch George Soros, and undermine Catalan self-determination. Brexit is a national liberation struggle. We simply cannot afford to lose. Well, with a small exception to one or two of those words, I agree. So I think does Stephen Wolfe, MEP, who joins us from Strasbourg. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, George.
Let's start, if we may, with Italy, where, just like in Greece and in Portugal before it, the supreme arrogance of the German-dominated European Union was in full and ugly view yesterday, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was in the parliamentary chamber. I was about to do a speech on the increasing massive cost that the European Union is demanding from European countries to pay. 1.135 trillion is their budget, and they're going to be spending it on...
Has it even been audited, Stephen?
No, it hasn't, but they were about to spend huge amounts of money on creating a European army. And I raised the point to them, as said in my speech, you want to spend billions on a European army when you still have 25% of the euro area are in poverty and social exclusion. You have youth unemployment across the euro area at 20.9%, and in countries like Greece, it's 52%. And during the debate, you heard Oettinger, who is a German minister in the Commission, who is effectively in charge of spending this 1.135 trillion euros. And he said about Italy this. He said, George, unbelievable statement. He said, the markets, the financial markets, the markets will teach the Italian voters who to vote for and do the right thing.
Incredible arrogance. I mean, Teutonic, Prussian arrogance to a country which Germany formerly occupied and clearly thinks it still does.
But his arrogance is something that is just an intrinsic and core belief in those who support the European Union. I've heard people say, when we talk about Italy, that the Italians need to understand they are not allowed to leave the euro, they are not allowed to leave the European Union. It is essential that they stay, and it doesn't matter what their voters will say. And we've heard this before. We've heard it when the Irish were told to vote again over the treaties. The French were told to vote again in their treaties, and so was the Dutch were told. And we are now being forced in the United Kingdom to contemplate a second referendum because we've dared to leave. The European Union does not like the idea that the European electorate can choose politicians and parties who follow their mandates that they want. You have to follow the EU way or no way at all.
Of course, in the case of Ireland and France, the people in the end did as they were bidden. But that's not likely, it seems to me, to happen in Italy, because the anti-democratic outrage of the president acting on orders from Brussels, I have no doubt, of blackballing the finance minister nomination of a coalition that commanded the support of more than half of the Italian voters is such that new elections become inevitable. And I doubt if the Italians will do what the markets and Oettinger are telling them to do.
Well, I hope not. And I was with last night and yesterday afternoon with a number of the Five Star movement. I've worked with them on a number of projects. I'm working on them on other things. And we had long discussions about this. And what they told me was very clear, and in some ways an element of scary politics. They said, listen, Stephen, you've got to understand that the European Union worked with the Italian elites to remove Berlusconi. Even if we didn't like Berlusconi, they effectively removed him in 2011 to 13 to replace him with the European Commissioner, Mario Monti. They are refusing to allow our own finance minister this time round, Di Maio, and they're replacing him with Carlo Cottarelli, who's
of the IMF.
Director, his ex-IMF, who's known as the cutter or the scissor man because he cuts public funding and hits the poor at the hardest he can. And what they then said is this, Stephen, they will try their best to prevent us having an election in August or September or October, and they will try and push it into next year to give them as long enough chance they can to ensure that they can change the constitution, working in a way to prevent us winning an election, as they've done in the past.
Well, we'll see how that all works out. I very much hope that the outcome is not as it was in Ireland and in France. And indeed, you may recall that Sinn Féin were prominently opposed to the treaty and big in the campaign against it, but have now become the most Europhile party in Europe for their own reasons, no doubt. We'll see what happens in Italy. What about Britain, Stephen? We have today, quite brazen, got to hand it to him. It's not just giving over the money and keeping in the background. George Soros is telling us what to do today and putting 6.5 million on top of the millions he's already given, where his mouth is. He is demanding that the British people vote again until they vote the right way.
Well, we've heard it before in Europe, in the European Union, to us before, and those other countries we've mentioned. George, it is an absolute disgrace. I remember clearly, and you've probably seen over the few weeks, how so many of the Remainers complained that there were billionaires out who are not British putting money into the Leave campaign to say that we could leave the European Union, and yet you don't hear one word of them opposing a billionaire who made his money on helping bring down our financial system in the market crash many years ago. He made billions on the day our pound and interest rates rose. He's made those money, and now he's demanding that we stay in a European Union because he feels it's right for Britain. He doesn't have a legitimate right to tell us as an electorate what we need to do, and he should butt out, quite frankly. But the Remainers will allow that to continue. They effectively worked with the President of the United States, Obama, to come over and say that we should stay in the European Union, otherwise we would be at the back.
Yeah,
of the
that was bad enough. It's bad enough to intervene in our electoral process. But this is worse because we had our electoral process. We turned away from the advice of the foreign banks and American presidents that were trying to influence how we voted. And now they're trying to wreck a decision that's already been made by the British.
This is the disgrace of the heart of the anti-democrats, as I call them. And it's actually something that we've reached, I think, very clearly in our modern democratic history. We have a situation now where democracy is only democracy in the minds of those who believe that you voted for their own ideas. And that idea is you stay along the route of a corporatist European Union with globalist ideas where the corporates control everything, the markets, as Oettinger says. And what shocks me is how many young people in our country actually believe that the European Union is an ideal of equality rather than what Oettinger says, it's control of the markets and corporates over our lives. Lives where they can decide who's going to be in our government as they want in Italy.
Well, they keep telling us that young people in Britain love the EU, in which case they've never spoken to any of the young people in the EU. They haven't spoken to the half of all Greek young people that are unemployed. They haven't spoken to the half of all Spanish young people that are unemployed. They haven't spoken to the young people in Portugal and in many other places, not least of them in Italy.
And when they find young people that are opposed to the European Union, as they do in their millions in Poland and their millions in Hungary, they tell them that they're racist and xenophobic. And as we saw only yesterday again, George, they've turned around to Poland and Hungary and said, because you are voting a different way or doing things that we don't like, we're going to cut 33 billion euros from the money that you would have from the European Union. Take a picture of all of this, George, overall. In Italy, they're changing the government and allowing their own people from the IMF to be put in charge. In Catalonia, they're effectively expelling the leaders who've been elected by the people in Carles Puigdemont to leave Spain and now being arrested on European arrest warrants in Germany and saying that they can ban the Catalonian flag. In Poland and Hungary, they're removing 33 billion because of the people have voted for leaders who audaciously stand up to the European Union. And in Britain, they're allowing quite happily to have people who are anti the democratic vote in the ideas of George Soros to fund campaigns to ignore the will of a referendum. Is that democracy or is that autocracy? And I think it's clearly the latter.
Now, Stephen, finally, and I'm grateful for your time, why don't you form a five-star movement in Britain? I mean, as I listen to you speak, I can't help thinking that the UKIP, before it imploded, made a mistake in not picking you as their leader. But there's a market for your kind of politics in Britain, and the five-star movement is perhaps a model that could be replicated here.
I'm very grateful for that, George. Thank you. And I do think you're right. There definitely is a space in British politics for that of a five-star movement. But you know how difficult it is to get on the ladder. You do know that you've got to. You do know that you need to have financial backing and organisation. But it isn't something I haven't not looked at, George, and that I will admit here on your radio station that I've had conversations with people. It's not an idea that's disappearing from my mind. And I think now that over the past few months in particular, there are a number of people who once thought, OK, we can trust the government of the day to get on with Brexit and allow us to have that vote. And by all means, people can oppose it, but they must do it once the issue has happened and we've left Brexit. But there are people out there now saying there is time for something else. And I hope that over the next few months we can persuade those people to come together and that we can finally have a party that actually crosses boundaries but says we can deal with the social issues, our economic issues in this country, but also allow democracy to flow.
Well, let me give you a hypothesis. If Labour betrays Brexit, as the Blairite ramp in the Parliamentary Labour Party is trying to force Jeremy Corbyn to do, if Labour becomes the instrument of destroying Brexit, there'll be potentially millions of Labour supporters so angry about that they'll be looking for somewhere else to go, and they won't certainly want to go to the Conservatives.
No. And there will also be an awful lot of people, and I've seen it, and I've seen the anger of people who have voted the Conservative Party, both in the north, in the areas I grew up in, and those who have been traditional Conservatives who say they won't vote for them too. At the moment, we're stuck with a UKIP that's imploded, and it seems to be a one-issue party in terms of just addressing
it's going
the issue.
more and more ultra-right, Stephen. I don't know if you're following
That's
it,
right.
but this baton is batty in the extreme.
And I think you can't deal with the convoluted and difficult issues of Islamic extremism by blaming everybody who happens to believe in that religion. And that's where they've gone down. And there are issues that do need to be dealt with. Everybody accepts that. But you can't just concentrate on that as the issue. And if you don't look at the broader political impact of economics in our country, what's happening to people across our nation, and look at it in a broader spectrum, then you're never going to be able to create policies that engage with everybody and actually try and say we can have a better future in our country by having policies that are inclusive and happen to deal with fair taxation, improving our NHS, opening the routes for education and training, to be able to control migration in a proper way, removing the language if we can, opening the doors to democracy, having freedom of speech, but more than anything, at the core of everything, the people matter first, and the elites must always come last.
Stephen Wolfe, member of the European Parliament, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. 0344 499 1000, that's the number to call. You can email me through the website at talkradio.co.uk. You can text me, text the word talk, and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal charges. You can tweet me, though, entirely for free at George Galloway at talkRADIO. Here's an email from, let me see, who? It says, thank you, Mr. Galloway, for mentioning on air, the only time I've heard it broadcast in the UK, the plight of the black population in Israel. Yet another act of ethnic cleansing committed by Netanyahu, who will have to answer for his crimes soon. The British government yet again says nothing of these crimes. That's from a central reservation. And Daner says, George Galloway, talk radio leading the way in the MSM. And the Communicipalist says the EU is attempting... Oh no, I've done that one already. Jock McSporrenberg says, sorry to be a pedant, George, but Elvis never recorded in Nashville. He recorded at Sun Studios in Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, same state, different town. And Sean Caden says, do yourselves a favour and listen to the Open University of the airwaves. Let's hear from the legend that is Damien in Brighton. Damien, before you speak, a large number of listeners want to know if they can follow you on social media. Can they?
Unfortunately, not at the moment, George.
Okay, that is a pity because you've got quite a fan base. Many people think you should be next to Corbyn. You should be in Parliament as a Labour MP. Go ahead, Damien. What would you like to say?
George, I just wanted to pick up on your comments about the implementation of the next Labour government's programme.
Yes.
Now, I think it's very important that the Labour Party is quite upfront and honest with the electorate about what they should expect if they decide to return Labour to power.
Yep.
Now, the Labour Party manifesto actually performs, I think, two key functions. The first is a short-term function and the second is a long-term function. Now, the short-term is that it represents a post-Brexit plan which will indemnify the country against any potential negative impacts from leaving the EU. And in that respect, Labour is the only party in the UK offering a post-Brexit plan. The Tory party doesn't have one, which I think demonstrates the recklessness, frankly, George, that we've come to expect from this Tory government.
Yeah, reckless and feckless and hopeless. I mean, they are all at sea. In my latest article on RT.com, I draw the metaphor of a sinking ship with people abandoning the Theresa May bridge at a rate of knots. And yet, that same helpless vessel is either neck and neck with or ahead of Her Majesty's opposition in the polls. You're a Labour man. How do you account for that?
A couple of points behind is better than 19.
Well, of course it is, yeah.
You know, so
but shouldn't you be 19 ahead?
Well, I think that when we hear these people talk about we should be 20 points ahead, I mean, that's a completely absurd proposition in that in the last 12 months we've pulled back, we've increased our polling by 50%. So the idea that in the space of a year, a party in a two-party system should have increased its share by 100% is patently absurd. So it's steady as we go, in my view, on that, George, and you have to earn the points.
This is the least persuasive contribution you've made so far, Damien.
Well, I mean, the polls are the polls, and I don't read too much into the... We've made progress. We've got more progress to make, George. That's my view on it.
All right.
But this was part of the contribution I'm going to make today, is that as well as the short-term function, the long-term is that the manifesto actually contains a strategic long-term plan for the country, and I think we've got to be upfront with the voters, because the Labour Party manifesto effectively is a contains and outlines a four-term programme of government, and that is a strategy, and that strategy can be summed up very simply indeed. And it is to invest in upgrading the infrastructure of the country in every region, and to invest in education from preschool to university, and in apprenticeships and in on-the-job training. And that will mean that we have a highly educated, highly skilled and well-paid workforce operating within an upgraded infrastructure, and that will allow us to successfully compete in the modern world. Now, from the economic models I've seen, George, depending on the number of policies implemented from the Labour manifesto, John McDonnell, as the Shadow Chancellor, would deliver by the end of the first term of a Labour government's first term between 3 to 5% economic growth. And I think that, that's exactly what the country needs at the moment.
Okay, Damien, I need to cut you short George, because it's time for the news. That's Damien in Brighton, who can't be followed on social media at this point. Let's hope he gets with the 21st century in that regard soon. You ain't seen nothing yet. You ain't heard nothing yet. I'm George Galloway. I'm in for Mike Graham. Between now and Friday, between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. 0344 499 1000. Or you can tweet me, as Jimmy has, listening to Mr. George Galloway on Talk Radio. My workmates are listening too. Although some of them disagree with him, they do like the fact that he lets people who disagree with him on the air, unlike most other presenters on other radio shows. Fra says, I'm not surprised Roseanne Barr wants to emigrate to occupied Palestine, another white imperialist European colonization project just like America, from the Wild West to the Middle East. And Hedy says, my goodness, GG and ELO this fine morning, the alphabet soup of brilliance. Not much longer till the end of May too, if you get my drift. Well said, Hedy. And John Hodgkins says, George, no doubt there are several reasons why young people in the UK are generally favourable towards the EU. Somehow the employment difficulties faced by youngsters in southern Europe as a result of the failed neoliberal economic model at the heart of the European project doesn't seem to cut through. I have a theory. For 20 years or so, vast numbers of communications from Europe have poured into schools, nice leaflets with prominent EU logos offering this and that opportunity. Many of the offers are worthwhile, but the subtext is unmistakable. These are EU schemes. Without the EU, all these opportunities would be gone. I want to believe that the EU supports Erasmus and similar programs for the good of the youngsters who take part. But sadly, I can't more than ever. The EU looks like a self-serving organisation in which everything, and I've lost the bottom of that, very good email that, it's fake internationalism. You see, young people are, generally speaking, internationally minded. Generally speaking, they don't like racism, chauvinism, Little Englanderism, and that's a very, very good thing. But the idea that the EU is the repository of the corollary of all these things is absurd. The EU is Fortress Europe, locking out the rest of the world. In fact, increasingly allowing them to drown in the Mediterranean and in the Aegean. The European Union stands for, implements the very antithesis of everything that young people in Britain need. I'm an internationalist. I'm an anti-racist. And I'm anti the EU. Let's hear from Ken in Luton. Go ahead, Ken.
Morning, George.
Morning to you, sir.
We've been pointing out for ages about the Italian economy, how it's on its knees and everything. But no one seems to point that out because the BBC won't let you tell them what's going on over there.
Well,
tell our youngsters.
I wouldn't tune into the BBC to learn anything, not even the weather report.
Well, they won't let me on, George. But when I talk about all the cracks and everything that are going on in Europe, I mean Hungary. They're not even in the Euro anyway. They won't have the Euro in their country. So why is that?
Well,
they're not getting...
Because it's not in their interest.
No,
the German economy, the German industrial economy, was always designed to dominate not just the western part of Europe, but also the central and eastern part of Europe.
That's what it was set up.
And you know, they used to occupy Hungary in the fascist period, and now they try to occupy Hungary and countries like it by virtue of the euro, by virtue of the European Central Bank, by virtue of the immigration policies. They seek to dominate all the countries of the German hinterland.
That's why the French and Germans got together to set it up, George. After the war, when coal was ever so expensive for the French, they come up with the idea of joining forces to make their steelworks a damn sight cheaper. Then they got other countries, now like the Warsaw Pact countries. They're in the EU. None of them have passed the EU
tests
to come into the EU.
No. These are political decisions, just like the opening of a new American military base in Poland.
Yeah,
there's no
right.
military need for that. It's a provocation against Russia. It's moving the NATO border ever closer to Moscow.
Do you know what started the Cold War?
The formation of NATO.
Yes, because after the war, when Eisenhower and Churchill went to Berlin, Stalin wouldn't go because he had an idea that Eisenhower was going to suggest carrying on through to Russia while it's at its weakest. And he's never trusted the Europeans since. And that's why we had this Cold War. Nothing else, George. You know, we call America our special friends. Well, our special friends didn't come into the war until the Japs had attacked Pearl Harbor. But their industry, George, was saved by a war because in the 1930s, you remember, they had all these unemployment and everything.
And we were still paying them until, metaphorically speaking, yesterday for all the lend-lease that they gave us. Ken and Luton, thanks for that. I've got an important announcement to make. Damien in Brighton has announced that he's caving into public pressure and is going on Twitter. More details to follow. Well done, Damien. Dakota says, up early this morning in the US, getting ready to go to work. What better way than listening to talk radio on my brother and my son's namesake, George Galloway. I missed the first hour, sadly, but I'm excited to listen to the next 2 hours. Dakota and his missus are expecting their first baby. Many, many congratulations to both of you, and I'm honoured that you're going to call the baby George. Average Joe says, George, what do you think the ultimate aim of the EU? Well, I think I've adumbrated that fairly clearly over the last couple of hours. Boris Johnson, says Frank, can find the time to criticise Russia for an alleged murder in Ukraine and ignores over 3,000 Palestinian demonstrators shot and now bombed by the Israeli army. It's a joke, this. The wild west of the Ukraine, where fascists are running free, where anti-Semitic hatred is unleashed on the streets, where people are wearing swastikas on their armbands in the streets of Kiev, sieg heiling, jackbooting down the boulevards, a wild west of organised crime and far-right thuggery. But it's Russia to blame? Really? London Ideas Tour. This is Mr. Sean Mitchell, says, Dear George, I wonder if you caught Mark Urban's report on Newsnight last night on the Skripal case, obviously designed to counter all the raging scepticism about the government version of what happened in Salisbury. Dr. Christine Blanchard, medical director at the Salisbury District Hospital, looked distinctly shifty when asked about the extraordinary recovery of the Skripals. The best she could manage to allay our doubts was the bold assertion that they just did recover, and that should be the end of questions about the matter. But to my mind, much more damning than that was the statement by the intensive care consultant, Dr. Stephen Jukes, that the hospital staff took the decision that they would not give a blood sample to the international inspectors. This was revealed in Mark Urban's interview, elliptically, without stating directly that that was very significant. Again, I'm losing the bottom of these emails. Very, very important one. I didn't, of course, see it because I've been boycotting Newsnight and encouraging others to do so. But I will read up about it, Sean. Thanks very much indeed for that. John Ward says the EU is the kind of oppression oppressed people round the world would give their eye teeth for. Really, John, do tell. And the Essex Socialist says, I'm listening in to George Galloway whilst cooking for my lazy teens. Thanks for that, Christina. And Chris says, George, I remember you telling members of the Question Time audience that they supported free speech for some, but not for others. That's exactly what you're doing now. I know people whose YouTube accounts have been banned because they're critical of Israel and anti-war. None of the videos flagged contained hate speech. Again, I can't read the bottom of that, but I'm not clear what it is that you're accusing me of, Chris. I don't believe in unrestricted freedom of speech. How many times have I told you that? I don't believe that you, me, or Robinson, or Roseanne Barr have any right to incite hatred against people on the basis of their religion or their colour, ethnicity, and creed. That's not freedom of speech, that's bullying. It's bullying people in a society in which white people have the vast majority of the power. And I don't like bullying. I hate it. And I won't back bullies, even if, like a stopped clock, they're right twice a day on this matter or that matter. Tommy Robinson was not exercising free speech outside the Leeds Crown Court. He was, as a prisoner on licence, bound not to commit the offence that he then did commit, and to which, by the way, he's pled guilty. So much for Tommy the Great, freedom fighter. No speech from the dock for him. He pled guilty to the offence of which he was charged, because there was no defence to it. Robinson is a hypocrite, a cowardly thug and hypocrite. And if you don't believe me on the latter point, take a look at his right-hand man in the EDL that was raping a 10-year-old child, a 10-year-old girl, repeatedly raping her over and over, while sitting in his spare time at Tommy Robinson's right hand. Well, the times have certainly changed for both Harvey Weinstein and Roseanne Barr. And in the first case, he's now on a rape charge and other serious sexual assault charges in New York. Did the perp walk in handcuffs, specially designed because, how shall I put it, like Roseanne, he's broad of beam. Roseanne Barr has now been sacked from ABC, and her show, Roseanne, closed down because of a full fat fascist outburst on Twitter, which was, I believe, the culmination of a trajectory which has been headed in that direction for quite considerable time. But to discuss the ramifications of both cases on the industry, the doyenne of entertainment journalists, author and all-round sage, Caroline Frost, joins me now. Caroline, as always, welcome to the show.
Thank you, George.
Let's talk about Roseanne first, if we may. What's going to happen now? Because overnight, Roseanne seems to have been sanctified as a kind of Joan of Arc martyr at the stake of freedom of speech. Tell us what she said and why it was so unacceptable to ABC.
Well, first of all, you're right. She's pitching herself as a sort of messianic fascist, which is an interesting image for the 21st century. What happened was, she occupies that space in America, which is obviously a potent brew of conspiracy theorist, defiant Trump supporter, and pitching herself, I guess, as the voice of the silent majority, daring to say the things no one dares say out loud, but they're all thinking. So this has extended. It's in the past. It's gone. Have a look at her Twitter feed. It's berserk.
It's been berserk for years.
Yes, I mean, she's kind of like a real-life Alf Garnett, and she didn't realise that he was meant to be an ironic figure. So anyway, so what's happened is it's culminating in her making, as you say, a barbaric jibe to President Obama's former aide, Valerie Jarrett, implying that she was the love child of the Muslim Brotherhood and an ape. You know, it's just ridiculous. It's no group. She's been quite democratic. She's managed to offend many groups in one short tweet. So quite rightly, everybody, what first happened, interestingly, George, you know how we like to monitor these trends, is that the social mediarati went in for her and demanded that ABC Network do something. And they didn't just do something. They've canned her, as you say, in a very short statement. They've said she's a racist abhorrent. These are not views that we subscribe to, and we've cancelled her show.
What's the consequences of that, Caroline? I mean, it's immediate unemployment for her, widely, thoroughly deserved. But George, poor George, he's now out of work. How are the rest of the cast taking it?
Well, they're all furious, if you believe the pictures of them this morning. We do know that even before ABC went in to kick her so-called under the bus, as she's now calling it, her co-star Sarah Gilbert was very quick to leap onto Twitter and to say whatever Roseanne's saying, basically, these aren't the values of me or anyone else on the cast or crew. I think there was almost a race to distance themselves from her. And so, but obviously it's going to be at least 100 people out of pocket. I mean, the show had been a massive hit for the ABC, and a further series had already been commissioned for next year. So that's 2 years' salary gone like that for everybody involved.
What sort of money was she on, Caroline?
Oh, I mean, if you include the fact that she's an exec producer, the fact that she's the star, the fact that she's got the power of knowing that show is nothing without her, she's literally on the can. You're talking tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions by the time you get into a percentage of the reruns in different countries. I mean, interestingly, Australia, not always impressive with its record of equality and inclusion, has been equally quick. Network 10 has said they're dropping the show as well. So all those lucrative exports, they've gone as well.
It's an expensive bit of ambient tweeting. She's blaming it on the sleeping tablets.
Well, I see that, and I think in ambient veritas, frankly, because I mean we've all done silly, stupid things when we've been a bit dopey, but constructing a carefully formulated racist jibe on Twitter, I hope, is not one of them. I mean, I just think that she's coming up with all sorts of things. On the one hand, she's saying they're throwing her under the bus. On the other hand, she's trying to explain it, and on the other hand, she's trying to apologise. And I always think be a bit doubtful of anybody who comes up with more than one very strong excuse for something.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at her, this is our 4:03 a.m. tweet on May 30. Don't feel sorry for me, guys. I just want to apologise to the hundreds of people and wonderful writers, brackets all liberal, close brackets, and talented actors who lost their jobs on my show due to my stupid tweet. I will be on Joe Rogan's podcast Friday.
There we go.
Now,
my podcast is available.
Yeah. Now, she's not apologising to the victim of her, I think you called it barbaric, very accurate, primitive also. I mean, it's at the knuckle-dragging end of racist abuse, calling
Absolutely.
black people apes, isn't it?
Yes.
It is unbelievable that she works alongside people of colour, even on that show. And yet she thought that she could, sleeping tablets or no, describe black people as apes.
Well, this is it's a cognitive dissonance, isn't it, George? It's the ability to, on the one hand, as you say, probably embrace and befriend those many black people close to her, and on the other hand, see it in no way contradictory to fire off a racist jibe to somebody that she's not involved with.
And as you say so, a very carefully put together one,
Yes.
offending a very large number of people at the same time. Let's go on to Harvey Weinstein. Ian McEwan, the author of Atonement, has sparked controversy with his statements about Weinstein, in which he said that whilst Weinstein seems like a moral monster, that this thing has become a bit of a circus, and that he implied that no fair trial was likely to be afforded to Weinstein. What's your take on that?
Interesting. I think his lawyer, Harvey Weinstein's lawyer, was very quick to use as his primary defense last week. It shows that perhaps a weak case in the making was that Harvey Weinstein did not invent the casting couch. And I think that could be along the lines of Ian McEwan's implications, that there are so many other heads that could be on the chopping block, but somehow Harvey has successfully drawn all the fire. I think we're seeing in Harvey Weinstein what we would have seen had Jimmy Savile lived. And you know how he became the sort of the lightning rod for so much. He was obviously, I should add, very much by far the worst of the cases. But this kind of one person starts to sum up. It's become a language. I was in a pub recently and some bloke looked somebody up and down and she said, "Are you Weinsteining me?"
Oh, my goodness.
And I just thought, goodness me, he's entered the lingo. He's given us a verbal ammunition that we didn't have this time last year. How things change.
Now, his lawyer's making the best out of a fairly weak wicket, and he's going for the very public defence, isn't he? He's standing on the sidewalk and trying to speak as an ordinary Joe. Come on, we're all lads together. We know how it works. That sort of approach. But that won't necessarily wash with a jury. Jury selection's going to be interesting.
It is, and as you say, that lingo is very much locker room circa 1992, and was one of the languages that propelled Mr. Trump into his office. We shouldn't forget that while we have a man at the seat of the highest power, effectively saying quite similar things, what it's doing is trickling down so that it's enabling many, many other people, but it's equally mobilizing all the people who feel very strongly against it. I think picking a jury in New York, which is on the coast and therefore much more progressive and liberal than perhaps the flyover states in the centre that did bring Trump to power, it will be interesting because is there anybody in the world that doesn't have an opinion on this particular case, either to or from?
If found guilty, he'd be looking at the rest of his life in jail, wouldn't he?
Well, what they'll do, a lot of these cases have fallen foul of the statute of limitations, so they can't actually bring them into the public arena. But as with Bill Cosby, it does give those women a place to come up as sort of see also ... and they will also get to vent their spleen. On one hand, it will be very personal and probably disturbing for many of those women. I'm in no way underplaying that, but it will at the same time be a massive platform for the likes of Rose McGowan and Asia Argento and people who are really quite vocal about it anyway. I don't think they'll be quivering with fear and holding back.
Caroline Frost, as always, a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for your wisdom. Caroline Frost, the doyenne of entertainment, showbiz journalists, author and all-round sage. Now let me read some of the material that's coming in. Patrick Vidine says, I don't agree with the vilification of Soros, but I do, on balance, still think we should leave the EU. But UK Labour are as wishy-washy on the issue as the Tories. People need to grow a pair and accept there will be some initial hardship and leave as soon as possible on WTO, World Trade Organization, terms. Vilification of Soros, Patrick? Which part of an American citizen spending many, many millions of pounds trying to subvert our democracy do you find worthy of criticism? And when does criticism become vilification? Seems to me that vilification is a bit of a code word here. Dr. Fath, URS, says, George, I've just tuned in. Have you yet discussed Richard Madeley showing mainstream media journalists what they should actually be doing to earn their wages? No, but I will be very shortly indeed. And Gaji says, long texts get broken up and hence the last parts get lost or arrive late. Warm regards, Gaji. And Dakota says, listening to Galloway making some interesting points on Brexit, whilst I'm very excited to hopefully one day return home after the birth of my son, my wife is still terrified. She feels the Tories are going to ruin our chances. Well, Dakota, you take your chances. Come back here or stay under Donald Trump. And Russell Brake says the longer and longer Brexit drags on, the weaker voters will get fed up and be tempted to change their minds. Just what the devious Ramoners like Liar, Soros and May's Misfit Party wants to see and hear. These traitors are hell-bent and determined to reverse an elected majority. And Denny says, elitists like Soros try to subvert democracy and his poodles insult Brexiteers' intelligence. The Soros myopic movement is dangerous for all. Keep the truth flag flying, George. Thank you, Denny. Hell's Bell says, Damien the legend could be a massive positive force on social media. Get forward, lad. Yes, and let us know your Twitter handle. I think Damien from Brighton is the obvious one. Let's talk to Grayson from Caterham. Grayson, welcome.
Hello, George.
Hi.
And congratulations on a terrific show.
Thank you.
Like a light in the media darkness.
Oh, how very kind of you. Thank you so much.
What I just want to say a little bit is to challenge you a little bit on the use of the term atrocity.
Yeah.
In relation to Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
You know, Grenfell Tower was this terrible, terrible tragedy. But, you know, when we use the term atrocity, it equates with the kind of things that happened at Manchester Arena and down on the Gaza border a week or so ago. And, you know, it implies deliberate killing. And whatever negligence, and I'm sure there has been great negligence over the Grenfell Tower and what was used in its refurbishment, I don't think we can say, I think it's actually very strong to say that anybody deliberately or wanted to kill anybody in Grenfell Tower or anywhere else.
Well, Grayson, that's an interesting argument. But of course, my intention, my deliberate intention, is not the issue. If I were a drinker and I drank 10 pints at lunchtime and got behind the wheel of my car and drove into a bus stop of children and killed a large number of people, the fact that I didn't intend to kill them wouldn't make it less of an atrocity. My criminal negligence is the issue. If I did not know that I might kill people having drunk 10 pints and driving a powerful car, I ought to have known. And as you may have heard my interview with the Reuters correspondent, I think last Friday, on the mother of all talk shows, made clear that crimes were committed by virtually everybody in the chain of command, from the manufacturer of the cyanide panels right up to the people who signed off work that should never have been signed off. These are, or would be in any normal country, certainly in the United States, would be designated from the outset as crimes and the people punished as criminals. We, in our very British way, set up at the snailest of paces a in the long grass inquiry to avoid grasping the nettle. That's my point, Grayson.
No, and I absolutely agree with you, George. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I did listen to your interview with the Reuters guy, and I 100% agree. If there should be a criminal inquiry, and if it's very clear that products have been sold that should never have been sold, and if it's clear that there are regulations that have been passed that should never have been passed, then these people must accept legal responsibility and be prosecuted. And I absolutely 100% agree. We shouldn't be wasting time or we shouldn't kick it into the long grass, as you put it, through a public inquiry. It's just that we should remember, there's a lot of focus on Grenfell, but it's important to remember that this incident, this tragedy, this could have happened in 50 local authorities. 50 local authorities have used this material. Hospitals have used this material. Hotels have used this material. Yes, and it could have happened in any of these places. And my only kind of question is, we know that the community in Grenfell is disadvantaged, is heavily ethnic minority or whatever. Yes, but it's like the tragedy is not made any worse or any greater by the nature of the people who it affects. Yes, it could have happened anywhere. It could have happened to
Well, yeah, I think it does, Grayson. I disagree with you on this. These were poor and powerless people. If they had been neither poor nor powerless, it wouldn't have happened. These people told the authorities that this very well could happen, and they were ignored, marginalized as a result, which they would not have been if they had been neither poor nor powerless. And the facts are that this cyanide paneling was not supposed to be used for buildings above 10 stories high, but the manufacturer sold it to the contractor, knowing that it was going to be put on buildings more than 10 stories high. The contractor put it on a multi-story tower block way more than 10 stories high. There's two crimes right for a start. The people who signed it off in defiance of our own inadequate regulation also committed crimes. The people who have steadily and for 40 years been pushing the poor, the powerless, the council tenant farther and farther into the margins, into this twilight zone in which scores of people now perished. I think that's an atrocity, Grayson. We'll just have to agree to disagree on that point. Now, let me go to Dell from Haywood. George, how about a montage of all Damien from Brighton's conversations with you over the years put up on YouTube? Also, consider taking him on tour with you, on the Friends tour. That's very good idea, Dell, in Haywood. I will do that. Derek from Dundee says, once again, the EU has shown its contempt for democracy. It will do anything and everything to save the single currency. They blackmailed and cheated the people of Greece out of their democracy, and now they are doing the same with Italy. I'm real proud that that comes from Derek in Dundee. Simon T. James says, not sure I buy the argument that the Labour Party should be 20 points ahead. It is a radical party, not a safe Tory substitute. People are a little wary of change. While a Blairite would get better press and more Tory votes, why win if you're Labour in name only? Good point, Simon. And Lizzie says, woo, Damien on Twitter. Is it an omen? Very good. And Chris says, Robinson's fans need to be told that his case has nothing to do with free speech. It's about contempt of court. I despise the guy, but I support his right to free speech. I only support threats and libel being crimes. I expected you to be less naive and see that hate speech and inciting racial hatred will be used to squash any kind of dissent. You might be sorry when the thought police come for you, George, says Chris in Colchester. And Scott says Galloway won't say anything, but the caller saying only Labour have a post-Brexit plan. Yeah, faced with a post-Brexit loss of £13 billion, we're pretty focused on it up here in North Britain. Our post-Brexit plan is to kick the Tories and Labour out of our country. Signed in bitter Scottish nationalist. Lizzie says, George's German domination of the EU, so hated by Italians, can be summed up as in the democratic EU all members are equal, but some are more equal than others. And David Leviscont says, the EU pretends to be, but it is not a democracy. Is the end of the road arriving for the EU? Very definitely. David goes on, Israel are trying to put in place a law which would make it illegal to film IDF soldiers and would carry a 5-year prison sentence. How do these people get away with it? And Bamboleo says, George, if you have ever seen the document Guidance for EU funding, such as WIFO, Welsh funding, at the core of getting awarded the cash is pro-EU propaganda at its very heart. And Ambrose says he was already on, this is Robinson, he was already on a 3-month suspended sentence from last year and had been warned he would go to prison if he reoffended. He pleaded guilty. No one to blame but himself. Now, oh no, my daughter calls her baby boy a little monkey, George. Do you think I ought to report her to the thought police? I know it's family and we're white, but I must do what's right or the progressives might pull my kilt down, says an anonymous texter. No, but if you're a powerful white person and you call a black person an ape, then you deserve much more than your kilt pulled down. You deserve the sack. And that's what the full-fat fascist Roseanne Barr just got. I don't know about you, but that, didn't fill me with confidence about the man with the stewardship of Britain's armed forces and his finger on our nuclear button. He was really Private Pike in that interview. But I don't know about you. I was proud of Richard Madeley, and if every interviewer of squirming, dissembling, obfuscating politicians went like that, you'd get a better class of interview out of it in the end, I assure you. And Richard's been kind enough to join me for a few minutes on the mother of all talk shows today. Richard, well done, and I'm sure I speak for millions.
Well, I can scarcely move in my living room for my swollen head after that. Thank you very much.
I thought you were going to say from the bouquets, because I've been seeing on social media written bouquets winging their way to you ever since it happened.
Well, the thing is, to be honest with you, journalistically and in terms of a broadcasting exercise, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I didn't expect it to happen. I didn't expect him to be so nakedly obfuscatory. They all dodged the question. I mean, he's obviously embarrassed by what he said a couple of months ago about shut up and go away. I mean, he sounded like a sports schoolgirl. It was ridiculous. But he hasn't spoken about it since. He was criticised for saying that at the time, but he's not actually made any kind of statement or comment. And I have a feeling this was his first live television appearance since then. So we dealt with the matter to hand, which was an exercise of sending British soldiers down to Malawi to help protect elephants from poachers. And then once we'd done that and said, well done, jolly good, we said, OK, let's play this clip. And we played the clip of what he said, shut up and go away. And then I very politely, I mean, you came in slightly later into that section of the interview, and it was a very polite question. I said, just looking back on it, do you think perhaps you were a little bit over casual? You were criticised for that. Do you think perhaps you could have put it in a different way? What's he feeling now, a couple of months later? And he started talking about paying tribute to the health service workers. And I kind of half expected it, but I never thought that he'd continue to obfuscate so nakedly, because in doing so, it seems to me he's completely misunderstanding the perceptions of the audience, because clearly the audience watching yesterday could hear what he was doing. If I could hear what he was doing, they could hear what he was doing. And I think that since I don't do daily television or daily radio like I used to, I do it in bursts. I'm filling in for Piers Morgan at the moment. It's given me more time, actually, to listen to those kinds of programs and to listen to those kinds of interviews. And what struck me in recent years is that politicians are getting away with it more and more. There's almost a kind of a glum resignation by quite a lot of broadcasters that this is what they're going to do and there's nothing they can do about it.
Well, that's why people are abandoning mainstream media increasingly, yes. Richard, because yes. They know that they're not getting the answers they want.
Yes, I think you're exactly right about that, and it needn't be that way. As I say, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. I gave him 4 opportunities to answer the question, and by the time he was obfuscating on the third one, I thought if he doesn't answer it the next one, I'm just going to cut him off and kick him off the show, because he doesn't deserve to be on. And I meant what I said to him, and I said, I nearly said, I don't care what you said 2 months ago. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. I have no real interest in it. But our viewers do, and they would like to know what you think about it. And in not answering me, he was dissing them, basically. He was showing them no respect at all. And, of course, and he's not at all alone in employing these tactics, these shameless tactics. And, of course, what they're doing is, one, they're using them to give a semblance of answering the question, but they're not. They're answering a question that you haven't asked. But what they're really doing is they're taking control. It's an exercise in control. And what they're saying with a kind of a barely hidden contempt to the interviewer, to the program, and to the viewers is, I don't have to talk about anything I don't want to talk about. I'll set the agenda. I'm in charge of this interview, and I'll say what I want to say. I'll use this opportunity to get my message across, and I don't give a damn about the questions you're asking me. And that's got to stop. And it's
the better ones do it with rather more aplomb, Richard. You changed history yesterday, because I've got to tell you something you may not have known. This very man, Private Pike, already has a campaign organisation in place to run to be the Prime Minister of Britain. And nobody who saw that interview yesterday could possibly imagine that he was the man for that job. Your interview was up there with the very best of Paxman at the height of his powers. It's just that there are no Paxmans anymore.
Well, I think it's partly because, I mean, bear in mind I'm filling in on Good Morning Britain, so I don't really have too much of an agenda. And I have to say that the other presenters there, I'm sure, had they been taking the lead, would have done exactly the same. And I'm sure if Piers Morgan had been there, he would have been just as tough, because he is tough. He doesn't take any nonsense, Piers. But I think just looking rather more, widely abroad at programmes, I think there is, well, I hate to say this, but a bit of a cosy conspiracy. In order to get the big name politicians on, you sort of have to unofficially agree to play it their way. And I don't think that the public deserve that. I think the public deserve to be represented truthfully and if necessary, aggressively, to hold politicians to account for what they've said and what they've done. And if that means that they won't come on the show, well, too bad. Then that means they don't get the platform that they want. It used to be a deal. The deal used to, 10 years ago, he would never have done that. He would have had his 4 or 5 minutes about his African elephant scheme, and that would have been fine. Then I would have asked that question, and I think a decade ago, he would have given a reasonable answer. He probably would have said something like, I can't believe he didn't say this yesterday. He probably would have said something like, well, look, I was speaking from the heart. It was obviously a horrible incident. It's never happened in this country before. All right, shut up and go away. Probably does sound a little bit simplistic, but I was speaking a little bit emotionally. I was, like everybody, shocked by what had happened. Yes, if I could go back, I'd probably rephrase it and not use those exact words, but I'm not going to apologise for them because it sort of expressed what I felt. How easy is it to say that? It's so simple. But they've got arrogant. They've got arrogant, and they've got a sense of entitlement now when they come onto mainstream media. And I think it's our job to stop them.
Well, it won't continue while you're around. Long may you run on mainstream television, Richard, and there's always a chair for you here, if not, and you feel like coming back to Talk Radio. Richard Madeley, the hero of the journalistic hour. Same old song from the politicians, but Richard Madeley punctured it, burst their bubble. Let's see if it catches on. Ditu says, not looking forward to this Friday night without the mother of all talk shows. Never mind, George Galloway still on Talk Radio all week from 10 till 1. I did not know when I was given this billet to fill in for the great Mike Graham that I would not be doing the mother of all talk shows on Friday night. Even if I had known, what can I do? I'm a working man in my prime. I have to do and work where my boss tells me to. But I'm bound to tell you, I am really sad. I'm like a man separated from his wife about missing the audience on Friday night. I don't know who will be filling in for me, but I really feel that we have made that slot our own here at the University of the Airwaves. Now, Scotland the Brave says, F off, hypocrite. You choose to play the race vote, conning the many good, honest, abiding Muslims to vote you into power, ! Let us not forget you were booted out the Labour Party. You'd have us believe you left the party of your own accord. Double Talk Radio host being educated again. Let me just deconstruct that for a minute. I'm so keen to have you believe that I left the party of my own accord, that I spent thousands of pounds of my own money to stop myself being expelled from the Labour Party by Tony Blair. Hundreds of people demonstrated outside of my expulsion hearing. Expulsion, expulsion, expulsion. How many times have so many of you heard me talk about my expulsion from the Labour Party? But Scotland the Brave, whose avatar looks like a village idiot being hugged, Scotland the Brave thinks that I want you to believe that I left the Labour Party of my own accord. Paul is in Manchester. He's on the line and up next. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello, good afternoon, George.
And to you, sir.
Yeah, you've had to outline to the previous caller about the definition of criminal negligence.
Yes.
Well, I found it surprising that you had to go so far to explain to the guy. I mean, I think the world and his wife knows that there's criminal negligence and somebody should be brought to book or corporate manslaughter or whatever. But,
just on that point, Paul, you've heard me say before, when John Prescott was the minister responsible, I was on the back benches pushing through whatever law we've got now on corporate manslaughter. It didn't exist before. If it wasn't for Prescott, it would never have existed. He had to fight for it in the cabinet, and we had to fight for it in Parliament. And the thinking behind it was simple, that if you are a corporate and your negligence causes people's death or injury, you are criminally culpable. Now, for you and me, that is so obvious it hardly needs stating, but you've no idea how tough a wicket it was, Paul.
Well, I mean, that guy who you had to explain to, maybe the defendants, if there are any in the future, they will use the same thing as what he did. But putting that to one side, if I may, I've got reasonable grounds for believing, and this is based on Theresa May within 24 hours of the tragedy happening, that it took her all the time to turn up to see the remaining tenants.
Exactly, yeah. She also made a whole stack of promises, none of which have been kept.
That's right.
She said they'd all be rehoused in 3 weeks. I've still got, at my son's school, people arriving in taxis from what are laughingly called hotels an entire year later.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. But, I suspect it's going to be, I hope it's not going to be, but it's going to be another bloody Sunday. It's going to be the mother of all cover-ups, and it's going to be many, many years before we get to the bottom of it.
I agree with you entirely, yeah. I mean, it's the typical British way, isn't it? Instead of bang, charged, court, trial, it's let's boot this into the longest grass we can find. Stuff it with the most stuffed shirt establishment cronies that we can, and hope we can manage a result at the other side as long away as possible.
Yeah, before I sign off, I was a soldier in the early 70s. I served 2 years in Northern Ireland in the height of the guerrilla war with the provost. There were, under international law, it was laid down in the shape of the blue and yellow cards for instructions for opening fire. And I'm ashamed to say what the paras did was totally wrong. But there was, putting that to one side, the cover-up for 30 years, the search for the truth. And I think it's going to be the same with Grenfell.
Yeah, I actually feel exactly the same way, Paul. I've got very little confidence in the inquiry process that they have laid out. I hope I'm pleasantly surprised, but I will be very surprised. Paul in Manchester, many thanks for the call. 0344 499 1000. You've got 20 minutes left. Fantastic amount of support for Richard Madeley. Lizzie says, spot on journalistic integrity, Richard. The fireplace salesman Pike brought to book. And David Leviscont says, fantastic, Richard. I hope you get lots of praise and others follow your lead and refuse to just toe the line. Well done, Richard. You've gained a great deal of respect from the whole of the country. Keep it up. I think that's absolutely true. And Andrew says on the SMS, George, Private Pike wears that fixed grin that tells the world he hasn't got a clue about his brief, his job, or his own personal development. I really meant what I said to Richard. His prime ministerial pretensions came tumbling down thanks to Richard Madeley. And Zach Buffont says, not really to me, but to talkRADIO, you've ruined my Friday evening. Where am I going to get my weekly dose of truth, compassion, and wisdom? And Patrick says, vilification means criticism in my book, George, and to suggest I'm using it as some sort of code word is at best strange. George Soros may indeed be one of the establishment elite controllers, but his motives may be genuine with regard to the EU. Well, they may be genuine, But it's nothing to do with him, Patrick. It's nothing to do with George Soros, whether the British people decide to leave the EU or not. It's not his business. Get his hands and his money out of our affairs, is all I'm saying. That isn't vilification. Now, Sky News and the University of Manchester have produced an amazing picture, and a dismal one at that, of the North-South divide. Young men in the North are living shorter lives than those in the South, with an alarming rise in deaths caused by drugs, alcohol, and suicide. It shows that as well as cancer and heart disease, the big killers of young men aged between 25 and 44 in the North are alcohol, drugs, and suicide. And here's a number that stunned me. Since 1965, about 1.2 million more people have died before the age of 75 in the North than in the South. I could go on, but the hour is late, and I've got the author of much of the study, co-author of all of it, Dr. Evan Kontopantelis, who's Professor in Data Science and Service Research at the University of Manchester, who's kindly agreed to join us today. Professor, thank you for that. Give us, if you will, the headlines, and they are very dismal reading, of your epic work.
Thank you for the invite and your kind words. Well, it's strange, but it's not really news. The only novel finding of the study is actually quantifying the numbers, which are, make a stark reading, and the reasons, the underlying reasons. So we knew there was a divide between the North and the South in terms of premature mortality. And it's not only in men, it's in women as well, for the same reasons to a large extent. But obviously, because mortality is higher in men in those age groups, the difference is much greater in that particular subgroup between the North and the South.
It's not just, it's not really a matter of geography, though, Professor, is it? Because I represented the city of Glasgow in Parliament for many years, and you could stand in one part of Glasgow, in Drumchapel, and look across a grassy knoll at Bearsden in Glasgow, but for 10 years less than they could look at you, because you were going to die 10 years earlier. It's about poverty, isn't it?
I guess that's exactly right. And unfortunately, we only looked into England, so it will be interesting to look into what's happening in Scotland. And that's what you described is known in the literature as the Glasgow effect. It's so unique to Glasgow compared to the rest of Scotland as well. And what we found in England, there is a unique effect attributed to London, where all the power and all the wealth seems to be concentrated. And that's traditionally what England and the UK has been a very centralized monarchy. And the opportunities are fewer and far between for people in the north. And that was one of the novelties of the work, that we looked at regional variability as well, not just the north-south dichotomy. And there was variation, but the big outlier in terms of better outcomes was London.
Yes, I mean, as long as I've been alive, it has been, at least nominally, government policy to redistribute wealth, government departments, investment, and so on, to try and, if you like, internally export some of the South and Southeast's prosperity to the North. But your study seems to say that hasn't really worked.
Well, it has worked. It worked for a long time. But then we had the 2008 crisis, which actually made things much worse. And we've seen in other research that the north of England, I should specify, is underfunded compared to the health needs. So primary care in the north is underfunded compared to the south, because the complexities of the health needs of the people in the north, when you account for that, that's not taken into account in the funding. We see that younger people have much fewer opportunities to wealth compared to their parents. And again, all these underlying reasons, like you said, alcohol, suicide, drugs, even cardiovascular disease, are to a small or a large extent associated or driven by deprivation.
It's a phenomenal number. 1.2 million more people died before the age of 75 in the north than in the south. Just imagine that. That would have been another 1.2 million people that would have lived, that would have contributed, that would have had families, would have had a life, and they were all gone. And really, because they were living up there rather than down here.
Yes, obviously. I mean, it's closer to 1 million. That was a small mistake there. But and obviously, we don't account for the length of time. Somebody might have died 3 or 4 months later. So overall, we don't account for the years. But the fact that many people, if you took the same person, say with the same characteristics, and you put them in the north or the south, chances were they would live longer in the south, and would be much more likely that to be the case, which is striking, really. And we see that all across the north, and it is to a large extent down deprivation. In our study, we found that 2/3 of the mortality actually was explained by measured deprivation. The other third was not, but then it might be a measured deprivation. It might be cultural factors at play, because alcohol obviously has a big role in this.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that, Professor, just in the couple of minutes we've got left. You know, I'm an abstainer all my life myself, but people drink alcohol. They drink it in London in profusion. There are people drinking alcohol everywhere. What is it about the north that has caused alcohol to be such a special killer?
We're not entirely sure. Again, deprivation will have a big role to play because alcoholism, alcohol abuse, it's what it's called as diseases of despair, for example. That's routinely called. So people that have nothing to look up to might turn to alcohol. That's one element to it. The other might be cultural, like I said. So you see in the news the party cities of the north. You see Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle. There is a culture of, to some extent, of partying and alcohol and drug abuse. I'm not sure that's necessarily different to what happens in London, but that's what the figures point towards.
Tell me finally, you made a good, wise decision to team up with Sky News, because that guarantees at least a lot of publicity for your report. What are you expecting to happen next?
Well, like our previous work, which only looked at the numbers rather than underlying causes, we are trying to get the government engaged in a discussion. I mean, devolution, I think, is a step in the right direction, but devolution came with significantly less money that it should have. And you did mention that there was some redistribution of the wealth. I mean, I'm sure you're well aware of all the austerity that has come to the north and the south to a large extent, but that austerity seems to be hitting the north much, much harder. And that's the downfall from the 2008 crisis, really, and where we are now. Brexit, I wouldn't think that's completely irrelevant to the desolation of the north.
Okay, Professor, unfortunately we've run out of time. Professor Evan Kontopatelis, he has produced with Sky News a tremendous report that everyone should read. Here's a tweet from Ofsted, which says, I agree to your points about Grenfell. They know most people would have forgotten their anger by the time the inquiry is finished. Tony Bewdley says, congratulations and thank you for giving us the University of Media shows. We'll miss the Friday show, but know your debates will not diminish. Thanks, Tony in Worcestershire. Patrick says, I wasn't suggesting you were vilifying Soros, George, but there are others. I must admit, Richard Madeley made some very good points in your interview with him, and I hope he's set a precedent for answering questions by terminating interviews with Pike